Captain Elena Vasquez endures mockery from fellow officers who dismiss her classified mission as easy desk duty. When their cruel whispers push her too far, she silently unbuttons her uniform and reveals the brutal shrapnel scars covering her ribs, proof she carried wounded teammates through enemy fire for their lives. Before watching full story, comment below from where you watching. Also like and subscribe for more stories. Kibbutz echoing against polished marble floors that had witnessed decades of military tradition. The room fell into a subtle hush as conversations paused, eyes tracking her movement with the casual cruelty that military hierarchies could breed. She wore her dress uniform with regulation precision, every ribbon and medal in perfect alignment, but something in her bearing had changed during the 6 months she'd been away on classified assignment. The whispers started almost immediately, carried on the warm evening air thick with cigar smoke and aged whiskey. "Look who's back," came a voice from the corner table where Major Thompson sat with his usual circle of sycophants. "Our little hero returns from her mysterious adventure." The words dripped with sarcasm, punctuated by knowing chuckles from men who had never left the safety of stateside assignments. Elena's jaw tightened almost imperceptibly, but she continued toward the bar with measured steps. Her left side ached with each movement, a constant reminder of events these men could never comprehend. The bartender, Sergeant Mills, offered her a respectful nod as she ordered bourbon neat. Behind her, the commentary continued in stage whispers designed to be overheard. "Heard she was attached to some special operations unit," Lieutenant Colonel Barnes muttered to his companions. "Probably spent 6 months filing paperwork in Kuwait while claiming combat pay. You know how it is with these diversity promotions," Thompson added, his voice carrying just enough to reach Elena's ears. "Send them somewhere dangerous sounding, let them collect some participation ribbons, then parade them around as examples of female leadership." The bourbon burned going down, but not nearly as much as the memories that threatened to surface. Elena had learned to compartmentalize during her recovery, to lock away the images and sounds that could reduce her to a shaking wreck in the middle of a briefing. But here, surrounded by the casual dismissal of men who had never carried a wounded teammate through enemy fire, the walls she'd built began to crack. 6 months ago she had been a different person entirely. Captain Elena Vasquez, intelligence officer, had volunteered for attachment to Task Force Viper, a joint special operations unit conducting deep reconnaissance in the mountains of Afghanistan. The mission parameters had been straightforward: infiltrate a Taliban compound, gather intelligence on weapons caches, and extract without engagement. Clean, simple, the kind of operation that looked good on paper and read even better in after-action reports. The team had been small but experienced. Master Sergeant Jake Morrison, a Green Beret with 15 years of combat experience and a reputation for bringing everyone home. Staff Sergeant Maria Santos, a medic whose steady hands had saved more lives than she could count. Specialist Tommy Chin, barely 22 but already a legend among radio operators for his ability to maintain communications in impossible conditions. And Elena, the intelligence specialist whose job was to identify and document everything they found. They had inserted via helicopter at 0200 hours, 3 clicks from the target compound. The moonless night provided perfect cover as they moved through terrain so rugged it seemed designed by God himself to break ankles and twist knees. Elena remembered the weight of her pack, loaded with surveillance equipment and extra ammunition, cutting into her shoulders as they climbed. The thin mountain air had burned her lungs with each labored breath. "Movement 2 o'clock, Morrison had whispered into his throat mic as they approached the compound. Through her night vision goggles, Elena had seen the guard patrol, 3 men walking the perimeter with the casual confidence of people who believe themselves safe in their mountain fortress. They had waited 47 minutes for the patrol to pass before slipping through a gap in the compound's outer wall. The intelligence gathering had gone smoothly, too smoothly, Elena realized now. They had found the weapons cache exactly where intelligence reports had indicated, documented serial numbers and country of origin with military precision, and prepared for extraction right on schedule. It was Chin who had first noticed something wrong. "Captain, I'm getting weird interference on the radio. Command signal is breaking up." His voice had carried the slightest tremor of concern, the kind that experienced soldiers learn to trust implicitly. Elena had checked her watch. 0347 hours. They were ahead of schedule, well within the window for extraction. "Try alternate frequencies," she had ordered, but even as she spoke, a cold certainty had settled in her stomach. Something was wrong. The attack had come from 3 directions simultaneously, muzzle flashes lighting up the compound like deadly fireworks. The Taliban fighters had been waiting, positioned with the patience of hunters who knew their prey would come to them. Elena's team had walked into a perfect ambush, and she realized with horrible clarity that their intelligence had been compromised. Contact. Contact. We are taking heavy fire. Morrison's voice had cut through the chaos as bullets whined overhead like angry hornets. Elena had pressed herself against a mud brick wall, feeling fragments of ancient clay shower down as enemy rounds chewed through their cover. Santos had been the first hit, a sniper's bullet catching her in the shoulder and spinning her to the ground. Elena had watched the medic's blood spread across the dusty earth while automatic weapons fire kept them pinned down. Chen had been trying desperately to reach extraction, his radio crackling with static and desperate pleas for immediate support. Negative on air support, came the response when he finally established contact. Area is too hot. You're on your own until you can reach the alternate extraction point. The alternate extraction point was 2 kilometers away, across open ground that the enemy now controlled. Elena had looked at her wounded teammate, at Morrison's grim expression, at Chen's white-knuckled grip on his rifle, and made the decision that would haunt her dreams for months to come. We're not leaving Santos, she had said, her voice carrying an authority that surprised even her. We move as a team or we don't move at all. What followed had been 47 minutes of pure hell. Elena and Morrison had taken turns carrying Santos while Chen provided covering fire and maintained communication with headquarters. The enemy had pursued them relentlessly, firing from positions that seemed to anticipate their every move. It was during the third bound, as they crossed a narrow valley between ridgelines, that the rocket-propelled grenade had found its mark. The explosion had lifted Elena off her feet and slammed her into a rocky outcrop with bone-jarring force. Shrapnel had torn through her left side, fragments of hot metal carving furrows in her ribs and puncturing her lung. She had felt the warm wetness spreading across her uniform, had tasted blood in her mouth, but Santos had been unconscious and Morrison was already moving to establish a defensive perimeter. Captain's hit. Chen had shouted, but Elena had forced herself upright, one hand pressed against her wounded side. I can still move, she had gasped, though each breath felt like swallowing broken glass. Help me get Santos up. For the next hour, Elena had alternated between carrying Santos and returning fire at pursuing Taliban fighters. Her left side had felt like it was on fire, every step sending fresh waves of agony through her body. Blood had soaked through her uniform and run down her leg, leaving a trail that enemy trackers could follow even in darkness. Morrison had taken the worst of it during their final sprint to the extraction point. A burst of automatic fire had caught him across the chest, and he had gone down hard, his rifle skittering across rocky ground. Elena had made a choice that still woke her up screaming sometimes. She had dragged both Santos and Morrison the final 300 meters to the landing zone, her strength fueled by desperation and the kind of adrenaline that comes when failure means watching your teammates die. The helicopter had arrived just as Elena's strength gave out entirely. She had collapsed beside her wounded teammates, her vision going gray around the edges as blood loss and exhaustion took their toll. The last thing she remembered was the crew chief's voice shouting over rotor noise, "Jesus Christ, what happened to you people?" Now, standing at the officers' club bar 6 months later, Elena could still feel every piece of shrapnel embedded in her ribs. The surgeons had removed what they could, but several fragments remained too close to vital organs to extract safely. She carried a constant reminder of that night in the form of jagged metal that would set off airport scanners for the rest of her life. The physical recovery had been agonizing but straightforward. Collapsed lung reinflated, muscle tissue repaired, broken ribs set and allowed to heal. The emotional recovery had proven far more complex. She had spent weeks in military hospitals, enduring physical therapy and psychological evaluations while headquarters decided what to do with an intelligence officer who had acted like an infantry soldier under fire. Morrison had survived, though he would walk with a limp for the rest of his life. Santos had made a full recovery and returned to duty with a Bronze Star for her actions during the mission. Chen had been promoted and assigned to a special operations unit where his communication skills were desperately needed. Elena had been given a Purple Heart in a private ceremony attended only by the hospital staff and a chaplain who had clearly drawn the short straw for duty assignments. No one had asked her about the mission details. No one had debriefed her on how their intelligence had been compromised or why air support had been unavailable when they needed it most. The entire operation had been classified at a level that made asking questions inadvisable for career-minded officers. Elena had been thanked for her service, commended for her courage, and quietly shuffled back to a desk job where she could cause no further complications. I heard she got some kind of medal, Barnes was saying now, his voice carrying the dismissive tone reserved for decorations he considered unearned. Probably a Purple Heart for a paper cut. You know how they inflate these things for political purposes. Elena finished her bourbon and set the glass down with deliberate care. The crystal made a sharp sound against the polished bar top, a sound that seemed to echo in the sudden silence that followed. She turned slowly, her movements precise and controlled, and walked toward the table where Thompson and his companions sat in their comfortable ignorance. "Gentlemen," she said, her voice carrying across the room with the kind of quiet authority that comes from having made life-and-death decisions under fire. "I couldn't help but overhear your conversation about my recent assignment." Thompson leaned back in his chair, a smug smile playing across his face. "Captain Vasquez, welcome back to the real world. I hope your vacation was relaxing." "It was educational," Elena replied, her hands moving to the buttons of her dress uniform jacket. "I learned quite a bit about the nature of sacrifice. About what it means to carry your teammates when they can't carry themselves." The room had gone completely quiet now, other conversations dying as officers sensed the tension building at the center table. Elena's fingers worked methodically down the row of brass buttons, each one catching the overhead lights as it came free. "I also learned about the weight of metal," she continued, her voice never rising above conversational level. "How much shrapnel the human body can carry before it stops functioning. How long you can keep moving when every breath feels like drowning." She pulled her jacket open and began lifting her white undershirt, revealing the left side of her torso. The scars were extensive and brutal, puckered lines where surgeons had worked to repair damaged tissue, darker marks where shrapnel had carved permanent furrows in her ribs. The largest scar ran from just below her breast to her hip, a jagged reminder of the explosion that had nearly killed her. Thompson's smile disappeared as if it had never existed. Barnes made a sound somewhere between a gasp and a choke. Around the room, grown men who had spent careers preparing for war stared at the physical evidence of what war actually looked like. "This is what carrying your teammates looks like," Elena said, her voice steady despite the emotional weight of the moment. "This is what happens when you don't leave people behind, even when headquarters tells you that extraction is impossible. This is what sacrifice actually costs." She let the shirt fall back into place but left her jacket open, the scars still visible beneath the thin fabric. "For 6 months, I carried Sergeant Santos and Master Sergeant Morrison across 2 kilometers of enemy-controlled terrain while bleeding from wounds that should have killed me. I kept moving because that's what leaders do. They don't leave their people behind." The silence stretched like a held breath. Elena could hear the air conditioning system cycling on, the distant sound of traffic outside, the tick of an antique clock on the mantelpiece. These sounds seemed impossibly loud in a room full of men who had suddenly been confronted with the reality of courage they had never possessed. "I received the Purple Heart for wounds sustained in combat while saving the lives of my teammates," Elena continued, her eyes moving from face to face around the table. "I received the Bronze Star for actions above and beyond the call of duty under enemy fire. I received the Combat Action Badge for engaging and defeating enemy forces while wounded and outnumbered." She paused, allowing the weight of these decorations to settle in minds that had dismissed them as political theater moments before. "But the thing I value most from that mission isn't any medal. It's the knowledge that when everything went wrong, when we were abandoned by higher command and left to die in a foreign country, I didn't break. I didn't quit. I brought my people home." Elena began buttoning her jacket back up, each movement deliberate and final. "Santos is back on active duty. Morrison is training the next generation of special operations soldiers. Chin is serving with distinction in Afghanistan. They're alive because I carried them when they couldn't carry themselves. That's what leadership looks like, gentlemen. That's what earning your pay actually means." She turned to leave, then paused and looked back over her shoulder. "The next time you want to question someone's credentials, I suggest you ask yourself what you've sacrificed for the people under your command. What you've risked. What you've carried." Elena walked toward the door with the same measured pace she had used entering, but now the silence that followed her carried a different quality entirely. It was the silence of men confronting their own limitations, their own comfortable distance from the realities they claimed to understand. At the bar, Sergeant Mills poured himself a shot of the good whiskey and raised it in a subtle salute toward the woman who had just redefined courage for everyone in the room. In the corner, a young lieutenant who had been taking notes on how the senior officers behaved quietly closed his notebook and decided he would rather learn leadership from someone who had actually led under fire. Thompson stared at his drink for a long moment, then pushed it away untouched. Barnes loosened his tie as if the air had suddenly become too thick to breathe properly. Around the room, other officers began quiet conversations about transfer requests and assignment preferences, each man suddenly eager to serve somewhere that would test his own mettle against the standard Elena Vasquez had just established. Outside, Elena walked across the parade ground under stars that seemed brighter than they had in months. The night air was cool against her skin, and for the first time since returning from Afghanistan, she felt like she could breathe freely. The scars beneath her uniform would never heal completely, but they no longer felt like sources of shame. They were proof of something she had always known but never been able to articulate until tonight. She had carried her teammates home. She had paid the price that leadership sometimes demanded. And now, finally, she had found the words to make others understand what that actually meant. The weight of command was not measured in rank or position or the deference of subordinates. It was measured in blood and sacrifice and the willingness to keep moving when every instinct screamed for you to stop. It was measured in the lives you brought home and the scars you carried so others wouldn't have to. Elena Vasquez had learned this truth in the mountains of Afghanistan, carved it into her flesh with enemy shrapnel, and carried it home in the broken bodies of her teammates. Tonight, she had finally found the courage to share that truth with men who needed to understand the weight of the responsibility they claimed to want. As she walked toward her quarters, Elena could feel the metal fragments shifting beneath her skin with each step. They would always be there, permanent reminders of a night when everything had gone wrong and she had chosen to keep fighting anyway. She had turned these fragments into something more valuable than any medal. Proof that when the moment came, she had been worthy of the trust her teammates had placed in her. The scars would fade with time, but the knowledge they represented would remain forever. She had stared into the face of real leadership and not flinched. She had carried the weight that others could not bear. And now, finally, she understood that this was not a burden to be hidden but a strength to be shared with those brave enough to learn from it. Behind her, in the officers' club, men who had mocked her courage were now questioning their own. The silence she had left in her wake would echo in their thoughts for years to come, a reminder that true leadership was not about titles or assignments or comfortable assumptions about who deserved respect. It was about the willingness to bleed for the people who trusted you to bring them home.